The man
Look
fell
at the
asleep at
floor,
his
Ethan.
desk, and she fired
This
him
is
on
the
the
final
spot in
warning.
front of the entire office.
Get it
She
together
didn't
now.
ask. She didn't pause. She didn't let him finish a single sentence. He just lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, hands still resting on the keyboard, and she had already said everything she needed to say. What she didn't know in that moment was that he hadn't slept in 51 consecutive hours. Not from laziness, not from carelessness, but because he was the only thing standing between that company and a disaster that no one else in that building had the capability to see. And now, he was gone. The door closed behind him at 7:52 in the morning. By 12:47 that afternoon, everything began to fall apart. To understand what really happened that day, you need to understand one thing about Ethan Cole before he ever walked through those doors for the first time. He was not a man who was easy to notice, not because he hid, but because he never felt the need to be noticed. Ethan Cole was 42 years old, an independent cybersecurity consultant, the kind of person corporations call when a problem has grown serious enough that the internal team can no longer handle it. He had no fixed office, no polished business cards, no LinkedIn profile with 300 connections and a headline that read like a graduate thesis. He had a laptop, a black notebook with worn corners, and a mind that understood better than anyone how a complex financial system could be torn apart from the inside without anyone realizing it until it was already too late. People remembered him through his work, never through his words. Outside of work, Ethan was the father of an 8-year-old named Riley, a small girl with shoulder-length hair and a habit of watching adults with the eyes of someone who had witnessed too many things she shouldn't have had to witness at that age. Riley's mother had died when the girl was 4. An accident. Fast and unfair in the way life sometimes chooses to remind people that it doesn't owe anyone fairness. Ethan had rebuilt his life around 2 fixed points: keeping Riley steady and keeping his work stable enough that she would never feel the absence of anything essential. He didn't complain about it to anyone. He didn't carry it out like a card to impress people or earn their sympathy. He just lived it every day, quietly and without noise, the way most truly strong men tend to do. The company he had been hired to work for this time was Meridian Vault Technologies, a fintech firm headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, specializing in high-speed payment processing and transaction authentication for thousands of businesses across the United States. Their system ran without pause, around the clock, and even a single hour of disruption could cause tens of millions of dollars in losses, along with the kind of reputational damage that no PR campaign could patch up in the short term. Ethan had been brought in 2 weeks earlier to support a leadership transition, assessing system security, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing a technical briefing for the incoming executive team. Familiar work. Nothing unusual on paper, until he started looking very carefully at the deeper layers. 3 days before everything happened, Ethan noticed something in the transaction authentication logs that no one else had caught. It was small, very small. A cluster of irregular requests appearing at low frequency inside the international processing queue, mimicking the rhythm of legitimate internal traffic precisely enough that the automated filters had dismissed them entirely. But Ethan saw it, not because he was smarter than the system, but because he had looked at enough compromised systems to recognize the way a real attack operates before it reveals itself. Amateur attackers make noise. Dangerous ones stay silent and patient. This one was silent. This one was patient. He traced the activity backward and identified a deliberate, methodical intrusion. Someone had gained access to a secondary service at the edge of the system's architecture, a low-priority authentication relay handling a narrow set of cross-border payment verifications. From that foothold, they had quietly probed deeper, testing the relay's reach, building a pathway toward more central system. Their goal wasn't immediate destruction. They were waiting for a high-volume processing window to intervene, redirect funds, or disable the reconciliation mechanisms entirely. Ethan escalated to his direct manager within the company. That manager, acutely aware of how badly a major incident report would land the day before a new CEO took the helm, asked him to continue monitoring and avoid creating alarm before anything was definitively confirmed. The message, politely delivered, was essentially a request to stay quiet and hope the problem resolved itself. Ethan didn't do that. He began building temporary isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as compromised. He constructed manual redirect layers to absorb suspicious traffic without triggering visible failures. He patched individual nodes, working through the architecture the way someone shores up a sinking structure, not with proper blueprints and materials, but with whatever was at hand, done with enough care to hold. No safety net. On a live running system, no margin for significant error. The next 51 hours were the kind of sustained endurance that most people never experience. Ethan barely left the operations floor. He drank whatever coffee was available, ate from vending machines, and changed his shirt in the technical staff bathroom around midnight. Colleagues saw him there continuously, registering his presence the way people register a familiar fixture, assuming he was managing a routine escalation. Nobody understood the scale of what he was actually doing. Then, late in the second night, he discovered something that shifted the situation from serious to existential. The attackers had embedded a delayed activation mechanism inside the processing cluster, a dormant trigger that would remain invisible during normal operations, but would fire automatically if anyone performed a standard system restart. Under ordinary circumstances, a restart was routine maintenance, used constantly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services. If anyone performed that restart without knowing about the trigger, every temporary defensive layer Ethan had built would collapse, the dormant pathway would open, and the attack would enter its active phase. Ethan wrote it all down. He built a file of technical notes, time-stamped log summaries, patch annotations, and explicit warnings. He intended to deliver them directly to executive leadership in the morning, regardless of what that required in terms of bypassing normal channels. He was going to make someone understand, but the body has limits that override intention when pushed past them. Ethan had been running for nearly 2.5 days without real sleep. Sitting before the running log display, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, he put his head down for one moment and didn't come back up. Victoria Hartwell arrived on the operations floor at 7:45 in the morning as part of a self-directed tour of the company's critical infrastructure. She was 31 years old, just appointed as CEO after her uncle, the company's founder, stepped back due to declining health. Victoria was genuinely accomplished, sharp, well-credentialed, with a proven track record in investment analysis and corporate strategy that she had earned rather than inherited. She had spent years proving herself in rooms where people expected her to fail. But leading Meridian Vault was categorically different from anything she had done before. This was a complex, aging, high-stakes operational machine, and she was stepping into it during a transition the company hadn't fully prepared for. The pressure to prove she was more than just a name on a family tree was enormous, and it shaped every instinct she brought to the role. She made decisions quickly and decisively. She despised visible indiscipline. As she walked through the cold, brightly lit floor past rows of monitors and tired engineers finishing overnight shifts, she stopped at the central console. A man in a wrinkled shirt was asleep at his desk. His head rested on his forearms, surrounded by more than 24 monitors alive with scrolling alerts. She didn't pause to interpret the screens. She looked at the name badge on the desk, read the name, and called it out clearly. Ethan jolted upright. For several seconds, he was genuinely disoriented, head heavy, eyes dry and painful, ears carrying a faint ringing as his body struggled back toward consciousness. He hadn't fully located himself when Victoria spoke again. This company does not pay anyone to sleep on the job. Every engineer within earshot stopped moving. Ethan steadied himself, recognized the woman from the company announcement he'd seen the previous week, and understood immediately what he was dealing with. He spoke before she could continue. "You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster." "Don't." Victoria cut across him without hesitation. "I don't need to hear anything on my first morning. Security, collect his access card. HR, initiate termination immediately." Ethan looked at her, not with fear, not with desperation, but with the specific urgency of someone watching a preventable disaster approaching. He tried once more. "If someone restarts the system, I've said everything I'm going to say." The room stayed silent. Several engineers who had been on shift for hours, who knew Ethan had been there nearly the entire time, said nothing. Speaking against the new CEO in her first hour would have been an act of professional courage that none of them could bring themselves to perform. Ethan removed his badge slowly. He didn't list what he had done. He asked nothing. He asked for nothing. Before he walked out, he looked at a younger engineer named Marcus standing nearby and said 4 words clearly enough for several people to hear. Don't restart it. Someone thought he was being dramatic. Someone else assumed it was the bitter parting remark of a man who felt wronged. Victoria didn't register it as anything meaningful at all. She had already filed the morning as a necessary act of leadership. The first clean signal that the era of comfortable carelessness was over. Ethan left the building at the pace of a man with nothing left in his legs. He reached home in a state that was somewhere between conscious and not. His phone had accumulated messages from work contacts he no longer had standing to respond to, and he left them unread. He found Riley at the kitchen table, working through math problems with focused seriousness. He managed something close to a smile. Then the sofa claimed him. He didn't take off his jacket. He placed the open laptop tight beside him, its screen still cycling through remote monitoring displays, and was asleep before he had decided to be. The restart command executed at 12:47 in the afternoon, during the early peak of the business day's second trading window. In the first minutes, there was a misleading improvement. Queue times dropped. Congestion patterns smoothed out. The supervisors exhaled. Then the authentication tokens went asynchronous. It happened in waves. The first sign was a cluster of transaction sessions reporting unexpected state mismatches, payments showing as uninitialized, as if they had never begun. The token synchronization service lost its connection to the primary routing pathway the moment the restart cleared the memory state where Ethan's temporary logic had been running. The isolation barriers collapsed. The dormant trigger fired. Outbound transaction routing began redirecting a subset of traffic toward endpoints outside Meridian Vault's verified network. Reconciliation for a category of corporate transfers failed silently. Several high-value payment instructions entered a suspended state that was neither completed nor cleanly reversible. Engineers worked at a pace that was fast enough to be impressive and not fast enough to keep up with the deterioration. They attempted rollbacks. The rollbacks didn't anchor correctly because the system state they were targeting had never been formally documented. It had been a functional construction built live, under pressure, by a single person who was no longer present. Marcus pulled up Ethan's repository notes and read them aloud to the group gathered around the primary console. The notes described the current failure mode with remarkable precision. Understanding them fully enough to reverse what was happening was a different matter entirely. Victoria was called down from the executive floor. She walked into the operations center for the second time that day, and the monitors were overwhelmingly red. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the tight urgency of people who know exactly how serious something is and are afraid to name it plainly. Calls from enterprise clients were already coming in. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer turned from his console, face pale, and composed in the way of someone who has decided to say the true thing. It looks like he was holding the entire system together by hand for 2 days. We just deactivated all the defensive layers he built. The phrase he used didn't require a name. Victoria asked if they could fix it. She asked who understood Ethan's patch logic. She asked where the CTO was, and what the CTO's working knowledge of the legacy infrastructure looked like. The answers she received didn't comfort her. The company was bleeding, and the only person who fully understood its circulatory system had been escorted from the building that morning. Victoria read Ethan's notes from beginning to end at an empty workstation. In the repository folder Marcus had flagged, there was a consolidated log file, time-stamped patch notations, and a plain text summary written like field notes by someone who had not expected time to revise them. At the bottom of the final page, in a font size slightly larger than the rest, was a line that had evidently been added last. If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a stage tag waiting to be triggered. Call me first. 704-555-0183. He had left a phone number. Nobody had called it. The engineers around her were doing their best work, and their best work was not going to be enough, and they all knew it. Victoria closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. The feeling arrived and would not be briefly processed and set aside. She thought about the morning, Ethan's face when he tried to speak, the specific urgency he had been carrying. She hadn't misread it as insignificant. She had dismissed it before reading it at all. She had been so certain she understood what she was looking at that she had refused to look. She asked HR for his home address. The file was sparse, and it took several minutes searching through emergency contact records before a current address was confirmed. She called 3 times. The phone rang without answer each time. His body, she understood, might genuinely be unable to hear it. She picked up her keys, walked to the parking structure, and drove herself to the address on the screen. The building was in a quiet, ordinary neighborhood on the east side of Charlotte. Older construction, a place where people lived rather than performed living. Victoria stood briefly outside her car, registering the gap between where she had spent the last several hours and where she was standing now. Then she walked to the apartment door and knocked. No answer. Dr. Carr, her phone, when loudered, and was reaching for her phone when the door opened and a child stood in the space it revealed. Small, with slightly disordered hair and a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The girl looked up at Victoria with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to read adult visitors quickly. "Are you looking for my dad?" Victoria didn't answer for a moment. She hadn't known there was a child. It hadn't appeared in any context in which Ethan existed professionally, because Ethan didn't use his personal life as a credentialing device. He had never mentioned it. No one had mentioned it to her. Riley opened the door wider once she determined the woman outside didn't seem threatening. Inside the apartment, Ethan was lying on his side on the sofa, still wearing the same shirt from that morning, his jacket still on. The laptop was open beside him, lock screen still cycling. One shoe had been removed. The other was still on his foot. A glass of water he had apparently poured and forgotten sat on the low table, untouched. Several empty takeout containers on the kitchen counter marked the meals of a person eating without attention across multiple days. He had the stillness of a person who hadn't chosen to stop but had simply run out of anything left to give. Riley lowered her voice the way children do when the sleep nearby is genuinely needed. "Daddy hasn't really slept. He said something bad was happening at work. He promised he would rest after he fixed it." The words were simple and factual, and landed in Victoria's chest like something physical. She looked at the apartment, the careful economy of it, the evidence of a life organized around necessity and love, and thought about every assumption she had carried into the operations center that morning. The image she had constructed in 10 seconds, the certainty she had felt, the complete and total wrongness of it. She asked softly whether Riley was alone. The girl said a neighbor would come over soon and that her father had only fallen asleep after he got home. Victoria understood with a clarity that was almost physical what she had done. She hadn't simply made a bad call. At the worst possible moment, the man quietly carrying the weight of the company's survival, and she had done it because the image of him sleeping had fit so neatly into the story she had already decided to tell. She touched Riley's shoulder once, gently, and asked if she could wake him. It took several attempts before Ethan surfaced. He came back to consciousness in layers, the way profoundly sleep-deprived people do. When he recognized Victoria standing in his living room, his first expression wasn't anger. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has just been handed one more demand they didn't ask for. He sat up slowly. He said nothing. Victoria sat in the chair across from him. She didn't arrange her words carefully or build toward anything gradually. "I didn't listen to you this morning. I fired you before I understood what was happening. I need to apologize for that." Ethan looked at her without speaking. He wasn't withholding the response strategically. He simply wasn't in a place where accurate words changed what he was feeling. She continued because the situation didn't allow her to wait. "They restarted the system. It's failing. Nobody in the building understands your patch logic well enough to stop it." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Not shock, just the particular heaviness of being right about something you had hoped not to be right about. He reached for the laptop and pulled up the remote monitoring interface. The metrics loaded and he scanned them for less than 60 seconds before setting the laptop back down. The numbers confirmed what Victoria's face had already communicated. He didn't stand up immediately. He looked at Riley first, asked whether she had eaten, whether she had finished her schoolwork, whether Mrs. Collins from down the hall had confirmed she was coming over. Riley answered each question with the composed patience of a child who understood that her father was being asked to go back to something difficult and was not going to make it harder. She said yes to all three. Something passed between them that didn't require words. Then he looked at Victoria. I'm going back because if the breach completes, real people, customers, businesses, workers who depend on those payment systems will pay for mistakes that belong to this organization. That's the reason. Not the apology, not the job. He stood, changed his shirt, said a quiet word to Riley, picked up his laptop and jacket, and walked to the door. He looked back at his daughter once. Riley waved with the stuffed rabbit's paw. Ethan almost smiled. Then they drove back to headquarters in silence. When Ethan walked back into the operations center, the room changed in a way that wasn't quite describable, but was immediately felt by everyone present. Not celebration. Something closer to the specific relief of a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the relevant capacity come back through the door. He didn't acknowledge the shift. He moved directly to the primary console, took the seat someone vacated without being asked, and began a rapid assessment of current system state. He asked for full log access, current architecture diagrams, and a verbal summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. He was quiet for approximately 8 seconds. When the summary finished, he was quiet for approximately 8 seconds. Then he started distributing the work. He put 5 people on isolating the anomalous outbound connections, carefully redirecting them into a controlled observation environment rather than blindly blocking them. He sent 2 engineers to construct a mirror pathway tracking exactly where the redirected transaction data was being channeled. He asked a 3rd group to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He asked someone from the legal team to contact the 3 largest enterprise clients with a scripted message acknowledging a temporary technical issue without triggering contractual escalation clauses. He asked one person to do nothing except record every command he issued, in order. The distribution of the work was its own kind of demonstration. Ethan wasn't performing mastery. He was executing a plan he had been developing mentally for 51 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than he had hoped. Over the following 90 minutes, the bleeding slowed. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from its connection to the core payment layer. 3 suspended high-value transactions were isolated and quarantined before any funds transferred outside the verified network. The intrusion point was identified and neutralized through 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration that closed the door the attackers had built and removed the key from the lock. There were losses. Several smaller transaction batches would require manual reconciliation. 2 enterprise clients would receive formal incident notifications. The security audit that followed would be extensive and expensive. But the catastrophic outcome, a large-scale diversion of corporate funds, followed by public disclosure of a failure of that magnitude, had been averted. When Ethan confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the intrusion pathway was permanently closed, the room released a collective breath. The emergency review was called within the hour. Department heads, the CTO, and the board's technical liaison gathered in the main conference room. The incident report was presented in full. Ethan had detected the intrusion first, 2 days before anyone else. He had reported it through proper channels and been effectively told to wait. He had worked for 51 hours to hold the infrastructure together. He had been terminated before he could brief the incoming CEO. His explicit warning had been dismissed after his dismissal. The restart had been performed and the result had been exactly what he predicted. Several people in the room began reaching for the careful language organizations produce when they want to distribute responsibility broadly enough that no single failure point becomes too visible. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, understandable given the circumstances of the transition. Victoria recognized the language because she had used it herself in other rooms. She understood its function. And she understood that using it now would be a direct repetition of the failure that had produced the crisis. She stood. This morning I fired Ethan Cole before I had heard a single complete sentence from him. I made that decision based on an image that confirmed what I had already decided to believe. I was wrong, and my error came close to costing this company something that would not have been recoverable. I am sorry to Ethan, and I am saying that in front of all of you. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something true and costly has been said plainly. Ethan, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single small nod. He didn't accept the apology with visible warmth or perform forgiveness for the room. He received it with the quiet of a person who had set something heavy down, not because it was resolved, but because continuing to hold it served no one. Then, after that silence, the man seated to Victoria's right stood up. Gerald Marsh, Chief Operating Officer, 11 years at the company. The person who had received Ethan's original security report and instructed him to stay quiet. His voice was steady, too steady, in the way of someone preparing to defend themselves without admitting they needed to. I want to be clear that my decision at that point was reasonable, given the context we were facing. We were in a leadership transition, creating alarm before full confirmation would have. Gerald. Victoria cut him off. He stopped. You received a security report from an independent consultant with specific evidence of an active intrusion. You asked him to stay silent because you were concerned about timing. Then he worked 51 hours to correct that mistake. Then he was fired for doing it. Gerald opened his mouth again. I don't think framing it that way. The board will conduct a full review of your actions, Victoria said. That will follow due process. But I will not allow this debrief to be rewritten as a communication incident. What happened is clear. 3 days later, Gerald Marsh was no longer the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Vault. His termination, unlike the ones earlier in his career where he had skillfully navigated consequences, was not clean. The board reviewed emails and internal records in full. The chain of messages he had sent to subordinates throughout the crisis. Messages that deliberately deflected accountability and dispersed responsibility, was thoroughly documented. His attorney reached out to Meridian Vault about a separation package. The proposal was declined. When the story leaked into Charlotte's financial community, the way stories about institutional collapse always leak, one detail at a time over lunches and phone calls, the offers Gerald expected from rival fintech firms didn't come, not because people knew every detail, but because enough people knew enough to avoid the risk. There was a moment, recounted afterward by someone who was there, when Gerald ran into Marcus, the young engineer Ethan had warned, before walking out, at a coffee shop 3 weeks after the incident. Gerald asked why Marcus hadn't stopped the restart command. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I tried. You were the one who gave the order. Gerald had no answer for that. That was the moment, according to those who knew him, when something finally actually reached him. Not the termination, not the loss of income, not the investigation, but the face of a young engineer looking at him not with anger but simply with tiredness, recalling a warning that he hadn't listened to. In the weeks that followed, the board moved quickly on Ethan's professional standing. There were offers of immediate promotion, significant compensation adjustments, and a newly created role overseeing infrastructure security operations at an organizational level that would have given him the authority his expertise had always warranted. What he negotiated first, before any title or number was finalized, was a set of structural changes. He asked for a revised escalation protocol guaranteeing frontline engineers a direct path to executive leadership when reporting security concerns, a path that could not be blocked by middle management protecting its own comfort. He asked for shift rotation standards in the operations center that made it structurally impossible for any single person to become a point of failure through exhaustion. And he asked for a formal policy protecting engineers who raised genuine risk alarms from any professional penalty for doing so. When he presented these requests to the board, the room was very still. Everyone present understood what they were looking at. A man who had been handed a significant amount of institutional leverage, and had chosen to spend most of it on policies that would protect the next person in his position from being destroyed the way he had almost been destroyed. Victoria accepted everything without modification. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident had been formally closed, Victoria was crossing the main lobby when she saw Ethan near the entrance. He was crouched slightly to adjust the strap on a small backpack, listening to Riley with complete attention as the girl delivered a fast and emphatic account of something that had happened at school. His face, which Victoria had seen under pressure for an entire day and memorized as controlled and precise, was entirely different now. Open, soft, lit from within in a way that professional competence doesn't produce. He wasn't a man in a building. He was a father at the end of a long day, and that was all he needed to be. Victoria stood back and didn't approach immediately. She had learned to recognize the moments that belonged to other people. After a moment, she walked over, not as the CEO, without any agenda. She held out a small, worn, stuffed rabbit, the one she had noticed on the apartment floor during her visit and found in her coat pocket 2 days later, apparently slipped in by Riley during the confusion of waking Ethan. She had meant to return it sooner. Riley's face arranged itself into immediate delight. She took the rabbit and tucked it under her arm with the satisfaction of recovering something important. Ethan looked at Victoria. There was no unresolved tension in the look and no performed warmth either. It was the look of two people who had come through something difficult, from opposite sides, and arrived unexpectedly at a version of mutual understanding that neither of them had planned for. Riley looked from one to the other with her characteristic quiet observation. Then she asked, in the completely pragmatic way that children ask questions, "Are you staying for dinner?" Ethan started to say something. Victoria smiled before he could. "Maybe another time," she said. Riley nodded, accepting this, and turned back to her father with the next installment of her afternoon at school. The story ended there, in the ordinary brightness of an office lobby on a late afternoon, with a child telling her father about her day and two adults standing close enough to see each other clearly. A man who had been publicly diminished had been publicly restored in that same building before many of the same people. A woman who had entered power certain of her own clarity had learned the most expensive lesson of her professional life, that authority exercised without the willingness to listen is not strength. It is a specific and very costly kind of blindness. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, in the complicated quiet that follows a crisis once the crisis has finally passed, something fragile and real had begun. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflection. All characters, names, institutions, and events are fictional or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. This story is not intended to represent any real individual or organization. The character of Ethan Cole in this story is a fictional character inspired by the public image of actor Ethan Cole and does not reflect his actual life, actions, or views.